Tavshin Lamed Ches, there were 3 Maamarim tied to Yud Shevat. The Rebbe said a Maamar on Yud Shevat, on Shabbos, and on Tu B'Shvat, the Rebbe said again a Basi Legani Maamar, which was Muga for Chav Beis Shvat in Tavshin Mem Tes, and that's the Maamar that we're learning. Basi Legani Achesi Kala. So the pasuk describes the way the Eibishter says, I came down to my garden. The Eibishter is describing the way he came down into this world, into Elam Haza. The way Elikus, godliness, came down into the world. And it's referring to the time when the Mishkan was built, that was the beginning of carrying out the Dira B'Tachtenim, that there should be a presence of godliness in the world. And the Maamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Basi Legani, from Tafshin Yud, that all the Basi Legani Maamarim are based on, is focusing at length about this idea how the Mishkan actualized the Dira B'Tachtenim, the presence, the descent of Elikus into the world, and how the Aveda that Yidden do, specifically Iskafia and Ishapcha, which bring about the Dira B'Tachtenim, the presence of godliness in the world, were all present, were all reflected in the materials and in the construction of the Mishkan. Basi Legani Achesi Kala, Mevi Kvet Kedushas Meiri V'chami Admer. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, Baal HaIlula de Yud Shvat, brings in his Maamar that this Maamar that the Rebbe is saying now was said on Tu B'Shvat, and the Rebbe points out Shashleimus the Kol Yemei HaChedesh U'B'Yem HaTesvav Shebeish Kaima Sira Bashlemusa. This Maamar, which is on Chamisha Asr B'Shvat, on the 15th of Shvat, is connected with Yud Shvat, because the Shleimus of the month is on the 15th of the month, when there's a full moon. So in the Maamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe, B'Maamarei HaYadua Dibra Maschel Zeh, he brings the Medrash on the pasuk. The Isa b'Medrash, the Medrash says, the Pirish Basi Legani, the meaning of the pasuk, the idea that's contained in the pasuk describing how Hashem says, I came down to my garden. The pasuk is describing Hamshachas v'Yiridas Iker Shchina Lemata Ba'aretz, the way the Shchina, and more than just the Shchina, but the Iker Shchina, the essence of Elikus, of godliness, came down into the world. What event is mainly being described in the pasuk? Says the Mefarshei Medrash and the Hemshech of the Maamar is the construction of the Mishkan, because Iker Hamshacha Zu, the main descent, the main drawing down, coming down of Elikus, of the Iker Shechina into the world, Haisa took place Keshehukam HaMishkan, when the Mishkan was put up. K'de'isa b'Medrash, like the Medrash elaborates and defines when did this take place, this Basi Legani, ve'emas sharsa shchina aleh, when did this happen, that the Shechina came down and dwelled on it ba'aretz, in the world, that there was Basi Legani, that Hashem came down to his garden. This took place b'yom shehukam hamishkan, in the day that the Mishkan was put up.
In the beginning, God created the earth. Wasn't it the Shekinah that traveled over the waters? So he already came down. So this is the second coming down?
Yeah, so the Shechina, the Medrash actually says that initially the Shechina was in the world, but then it was pushed away through various Averas, and the Mishkan was returning it, bringing it back to the world. But the truth is that the Mishkan was bringing it in an unprecedented way. The way the Shechina was in the world before was not permeated in the world. Merachefes al pnei hamayim that you're quoting, it was hovering, it was aloof, it was detached from the world. It wasn't within the world. The purpose and the goal is that the Shechina should be in the world, that started to become realized with the construction of the Mishkan. Like the pasuk says, Hashem instructs us, "V'asu li mikdash, make for me a Beis Hamikdash," which began with the Mishkan. V'az v'shachanti b'seicham, and then is carried out to v'shachanti b'seicham, that Hashem says, I dwell down in the world. So this is the basic theme of the Maamar. Now the main point that the Rebbe is going to focus on in this Maamar, which he begins addressing now, we say the Basi Legani begins with the construction of the Mishkan. When is it carried out? When does it take place? The Shechina coming down into the world is the Mishkan. The question is, seemingly there was an event prior to the Mishkan, that's also carrying out the Basi Legani. That's the Shechina coming down in the world, which is Matan Torah. Matan Torah preceded the Mishkan. So why do we say that the Basi Legani starts with the Mishkan? Why not before the Mishkan? Godliness came down into the world already by the giving of the Torah. So this Maamar is at length going to address that starting from now. Vagam says, although shegam b'matan Torah hoisa hamshachas v'yiridas hashchina l'mata ba'aretz. By Matan Torah already the Shechina came down into the world. That's what Matan Torah was all about. Kameshakasa vayered havaya al Har Sinai, like the pasuk describes what was the event of Matan Torah, that havaya, godliness, descended, came down onto Har Sinai. Godliness came down into the world. So why do we connect the Basi Legani specifically with the construction of the Mishkan? Yesh Leimar, says the Rebbe, the answer is, what do we mean when we say the Shechina coming down into the world? It doesn't mean merely something that's describing the Shechina. To really come down into the world, it means that it has to be present in the world in a way that the world becomes connected with the Shechina. Not just that the Shechina, so to speak, that Hashem descends into the world. And for the Shechina to be present in the world in a way that it's connected with the world, it becomes a part of the world. That began by the Mishkan for the reason that we'll say. Because Yesh Leimar she'ikar ha'inyan de hamshachas v'yiridas hashchina lemata ba'aretz. What's the true meaning? What's the true definition? What do we mean when we're describing the Shechina descending into the world? Hu keshahamshacha lemata hu b'pnimius. We mean a descent into the world in which the Shechina, in which godliness permeates the world. It becomes a part of the world. It's bepnimius, it's internalized in the world. Ba'ofen, it's in a manner, shahamata mizdachech u'mis'ala al yidei zeh. In a manner that this hamshacha is not describing something about godliness, about the Eibishter, that Hashem is coming down into the world, but this process is describing something about the world. It's a process in which the world became purified, became nizdachech, became more pure, more subtle. It became elevated. In order that this hamshacha is something that's describing, that's defining the world, it has to be that this is something that was brought about by the Avodah in the world. Shezeu davka keshamshacha hi al yidei Avodas hamata. The Shechina came lemata because the Eibishter descended. Just like if we'll say, if there's a very good teacher, a very good teacher means that he has the ability to take a profound idea, a lofty idea, and to bring it down to a simple student, to bring it down to whoever's the recipient. When is he really a good teacher? When the student himself understood it, when the student relates with it, when it goes into his mind. But when could the student understand it? When he did something about understanding it. The best teacher who brings it and explains, that won't bring the second step. And therefore there's something missing in his teaching. When do we say that godliness came down into the world? When there was something done from the world, that the world internalized this godliness. It became purified, it became elevated. Shezeu davka keshamshacha yidei Avodas hamata. So what is a true hamshacha? What is a true coming down of godliness into the world? When the mata, when the world, when the tachtein, when the bottom brought about this descent, and therefore only then does it become one with it. And therefore this is the difference between what happened by Matan Torah and what happened by the Mishkan. V'lachein oimer. Therefore, says the Rebbe, therefore the Medrash says, and the Maamar says at length, he says, the Iker hamshachas hashchina ba'aretz haya kishehu kama Mishkan. Therefore we describe and we define the descent of the Shechina into the world as taking place when the Mishkan was put up, rather than when the Torah was given. The hamshacha when the Torah was given was something about the Eibishter. Elikus, godliness came down into the world. But at that point it wasn't from the world, it wasn't by the world, and therefore it didn't become internalized, it didn't change the world.
Because the Mishkan was a Gashmi?
Because the Mishkan was a Gashmi, was done through Yidden. The Mishkan was something that people in the world, the Yidden, constructed the Mishkan. They did it. When something is done, just like in the example with the teacher, in order for the student to understand it from his side, it had to be that he did something about it. You could have the best teacher teaching. There has to be something that clicks, that he chooses, he works on it. Shalachein, therefore, by Matan Torah, we say, Haya hagilui lefisha. The gilui, the descent, the coming down of Elikus was temporary. It didn't last. It was during the time of Matan Torah, but that tremendous gilui, that tremendous revelation of Elikus that happened by Matan Torah was something that won't be repeated until Mashiach comes. That tremendous gili was a one-time event because it was something that came from the Eibishter. It wasn't part and parcel of the world. What takes place? What's the chiddush? What's the advantage of the Shechina coming down the way it was in the Mishkan? The hamshacha that took place when the Mishkan was built, was something that was brought about through the avodah, through the action and the work of people in the world, of the tachtenim, of Yidden, like the pasuk says, "Va'asuli migdash," and something that's brought about through Yidden, that becomes a part of the world. Something that's brought about from the world becomes a part of the world. It's bepnimius in the world. We know that anyone who learns even a little bit the Rabbi Siches and the Rabbi's Maamar, one of the most central ideas that's constantly repeated is that the purpose of Matan Torah, Chassidus brings the Medrash, is that there should be the removal of the separation between Elyenim and Tachtenim, between above and below. It says there should be Elyenim yerdu leTachtenim, that the Elyenim, which is Elikus, should come down below, and Tachtenim yalu leElyenim, and the below, Gashmias, should be elevated to go up to become godliness, to become spiritual. These two ideas, the Elyenim Yerdu L'Tachtenim, is describing the Hamshacha, that Elikus comes down into the world, like he brought by Matan Torah. There was Vayered, Havaya, Al Har Sinai, godliness came down into Har Sinai. The Tachtenim Yalul Elyenim is by Matan Torah, was the Kayach, that people, that Yidden should work and elevate themselves and elevate the world. The Tachtenim Yalul Elyenim, bringing up, elevating the world, that's what enables that the connection of Elikus with the world should become bepnimius, internalized. It should become part of the world. But that began mainly after Matan Torah. Matan Torah was the empowerment for that. What happened mainly by Matan Torah was the Vayeret, Havaya, Al Har Sinai, the Elyenim Yerdu L'Tachtenim. And therefore this Gili wasn't the ultimate Gili, this was temporary. The Mishkan was the beginning of actually being, in practically, the Tachtenim Yalul Elyenim. When you have them both, but when are they really Chad? When are they one? When the Tachtenim are doing the job and they're bringing it about, then it becomes one with them. You know, today is Chav Dalet Tevis, so there's a story with Alter Rebbe, I think we said here once before, that Alter Rebbe was once traveling with a group of Chassidim, and while they were traveling, they met a Chassid of a different one of the Rebbes then, of a different one of the disciples of the Maggid, whose name was Reb Chaim Chaikel Me'amdur, the other Rebbe. And there was a chassid of Reb Chaim Chaikel Me'amdur, and that chassid was davening, in the middle of davening, and the chassidim of the Alter Rebbe saw that he was davening with tremendous excitement, with love, with yearning, with intensity, and they felt very bad. They said, here, we're Chassidei Chabad, we're working so hard to learn Chassidus in order to become connected with the Eibishter. And here's this chassid of a different Rebbe, he doesn't have Chassidus Chabad, and seemingly his davening is on a level that's surpassing us. So what do we need to have all this work for? He got beyond us. So Alter Rebbe saw what was bothering them. He said, over there, it's not the chassid who's davening. He said, there it's Reb Chaim Chaikel who's davening. His Rebbe is davening through him. It's not him. It didn't become a part of him. He said, I want chassidim that the chassid himself should daven. So there it takes more work, and it seems like less result, but that's the kavanah. That's the purpose. The goal is that it should become the world itself that's one with Elokus. That started by the Mishkan. V'yesh lahesef. So the first point is the reason why Basi Legani, that event is the event of the building of the Mishkan rather than Matan Torah, is because the building of the Mishkan was an avodah that came from down below. And therefore that had the result of Elokus becoming one with the world. V'yesh lahesef. Further, the Mailas HaHamshacha b'Mishkan Mikdash, the advantage of the Hamshacha, the way it was brought about in building the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash al Hamshacha Shahaisa b'Matan Torah. The advantage of this over what happened by Matan Torah, is not just a general idea that we said till now, that by the Mishkan, the Hamshacha resulted from the Avodah of the Yidden in the world, and therefore it became a part of them. Elagam mitzad that goes further, it's also tied with the specific nature of the Avodah that the Mishkan is connected to. Sha'avodah deva'asuli mikdash, one of the ideas that's addressed at length in the Friedrich Rebbe's Basi Legani, Maamar Basi Legani, and in the many of the Rebbe's Maamar and Basi Legani, is the idea of the specific Avodah that's reflected in the parts and in the materials of the Mishkan, is the Avodah v'iskafia v'ishapcha. The Avodah, not just that it's an Avodah of a person in the world, but an Avodah specifically that deals with the negativity. To have to subjugate the negative impulses, iskafia, or transform them, to work with the negativity and change that. Hafichas hashtus delumaza. In the Mishkan, it's the materials of the Mishkan that were used to construct the Mishkan specifically reflect the krashim, the idea of transforming, changing over shtus delumaza, irrational running after lumaza, after negativity, l'shtus kedusha, to irrational dedication to the Eibishter. But al kapanim, the avodah of the Mishkan is not just avodah Hashem, but avodah of iskafia and ishapcha. And this is even greater. This brings further the effect of it being b'pnimius than any regular avodah. The gambam shacha shaba yidei avodah. Even in this advantage that we say in general is in the Mishkan, the fact that the Mishkan was connected to Avodas Hashem, it came from the Avodah, from the work of the Tachtainim. In that itself, Hamshacha shal yidei Avodah diskafia v'ishapcha, when the specific Avodah is an Avodah that deals with the Ra, with Le'umaza, with negativity and works on subjugating it and transforming it, and Iskafia and Ishapcha, Hinailas Yeser, that results in an even greater, a higher Hamshacha, Meha Hamshacha shal yidei Avodah b'inyan Kedusha, than the Hamshacha that comes when the Avodah is in Kedusha itself. A person can do mitzvahs, can learn Torah. That's a Avodah of the person. He's working, but he's working with his holiness, with his spiritual faculties, with his nefesh halakis. But when the Avodah is iskafia and ishapcha, that has this advantage in a greater measure. That brings about the pnimius much further. What's the reason for that? So this is the basic idea that's also in the Maamar Basi Legani. Ki yisrein ha'er hu min ha'cheshach dafka. It says in the pasuk, what Eir has an advantage? When is there the ultimate advantage in a Eir, in a light, in a Gilui, in a revelation? Is when this Eir is min ha'cheshach. When the Eir, when the revelation came about from working with and fighting with and transforming the darkness. Through dealing with the cheshach and changing the cheshach and transforming the cheshach, transforming the darkness to light, Nasa Yisrein Beha'er, then the light is a greater light, Kemevur Baruch Ba'Maimer. And therefore the Mishkan has the advantage not only in general, that the Mishkan was Va'asuli Mikdash. The Mishkan was brought about through the Avodah of Yidden, but the specific Avodah that's reflected in the Mishkan is Iskafia and Ishapcha. V'hine Yadua, we know that although we're describing now the advantage of the Mishkan over Matan Torah. Matan Torah was a great event, but it was Mitzad L'mayla. It was the Eibishter came down into the world. And the Maila of Vishachanti B'Seichem, of Dira B'Tachtenim, is in the Mishkan. But what was the Kayach? When was given the power for every Aveda that Yidden do? Was given by Matan Torah. Shebe Matan Torah nitin hakayach al klolos inyan Aveda. Any type of service of Hashem, we get the strength for that from Matan Torah. Dagam shehaham shacha shal yidei Aveda. Umikol shekein shal yidei ha'aveda dafichas cheshech leir. Although, as we said, the Aveda that we do after Matan Torah, when it's our Aveda, and especially when that Aveda includes Iskafia and Ishapcha, fighting with, subjugating, transforming the darkness. Yesh lo yisrein ala hamshacha shahaisa b'peyel b'Matan Torah. It has an advantage, it surpasses what happened by Matan Torah. It's greater than the hamshacha that took place by Matan Torah, which was not yet a result of the Aveda of Yidden. He says, nevertheless, Ze gufa shayidei aveda yuchlu lahamshech hamshachis elu. This that the aveda after Matan Torah is able to reach so far and to draw down a hamshacha that surpasses Matan Torah, hu bekeyach hamshacha shayisab Matan Torah. This is from the strength that we get from Matan Torah. The aveda after Matan Torah is greater than Matan Torah, but Matan Torah gave the strength to do that aveda that surpasses Matan Torah. It's like it says there was a chassid, Rabbi Michal Apatzker. It says a similar story about a few chassidim, that he was a great chassid and a Baruch HaKedesh. And it says his avodah with himself included that he slept on a bench for 40 years. He didn't sleep in a bed to try to not give in to his physical pleasures. At the end of his life, he said he regretted it. He said, it's possible that 40 years being so depriving myself, not sleeping on a bed, might have shortened my life by a day. Didn't help, doesn't contribute to my good health. He says, one day of putting on tefillin is Hashem's will, Hashem's desire. That's greater than all the spiritual levels that I'll reach from lying on a bench for 40 years. So it says that the sons of the Tzemach Tzedek heard about this statement that he said. They said, it's 100% true. He says, one tefillin is greater. He said, but in order for a person to come to that appreciation, that a mitzvah of tefillin is greater, he has to reach the spiritual height that comes from sleeping on a bench for 40 years. So the Aveda after Matan Torah is greater. But what gives the kayach for that Aveda? Matan Torah. But now the Rebbe and the Maamar is going to explain, how does Matan Torah give that kayach? It must be that at least in a subtle way, at least in a kayachtik way, Matan Torah somehow contains that advantage of the Aveda after Matan Torah, and that's why it's able to give the kayach. V'yesh leimar dezeh shabeh ha'hamshacha de Matan Torah. That in the hamshacha that took place by Matan Torah, Haya b'kayach, it contained in a potential form, because that we say that Matan Torah gives the kayach for this hamshacha, that means that within Matan Torah is contained in some form this hamshacha that happened afterwards. Matan Torah in a b'kayach way, in a potential way, contains ha'ilui the hamshacha sha'idei aveda. Matan Torah contains this tremendous advantage that's there in the Mishkan and thereafter, the advantage and hamshacha that is resulting from Aveda, from the work down here, that's a higher hamshacha. V'gam ha'ilui the yisrein ha'eira b'min ha'cheshach, and even more than that, it contains the advantage of a hamshacha that comes specifically through an Aveda that's in a way of iskafia and ishapcha, of transforming the darkness to light. So how does Matan Torah contain this advantage if seemingly Matan Torah was just the initiative, so to speak, of the Eibishter that didn't contain this advantage of Aveda? Because somehow in a subtle way, so to speak, in a kayachtik way, Matan Torah also contained the advantage of the transformation of the Tachtenim. Why? Ki hamshacha de Matan Torah, the hamshacha of Matan Torah, which was the initiative of the Eibishter, which was a descent of Elokus that came from Lamaila. But there was another ingredient over there. At Hoisa took place la'achrei sha'amar Yisrei ata yadaiti ki gadol havaya mikol alekim. prior to Matan Torah, there had to be that Yisrael, who was familiar and affiliated with all the Avodah Zaros, and he had to come and declare, Ata Yadaiti, I know, Ki Gadol Havaya Mikol Ekim, that the Eibishter is greater than all of these idols.
He was Chacham Gadol.
Yeah.
The other side.
Before, yeah, like we're going to say at length in the mind, we're going to address. Kediisa B'Zayar says in Zayar that this wasn't incidental, this was a necessary prerequisite to Matan Torah. Shal Yedei Shahoida Yisrael. Through that Yisrael admitted this, declared this, acknowledged this. V'amar, and he said, he declared, Ata Yadaiti Ki Gadol Havaya, that I know that Hashem is greater than all the other deities. Istalek v'isyaker. It became elevated and became holier. Kutsha berichu Hashem b'yikrei eila v'sa, in His glory above and below eila v'sata. Ulevasar, and thereafter, after that, Yoev Eiraisa gave us the Torah, says in the Zohar that this acknowledgement and this declaration of Yisrael, this enabled that there should be the giving of the Torah. So the giving of the Torah by Matan Torah followed a certain transformation of darkness. Val Yedei Zeh, through this, that like we see in Zayah, that the Matan Torah also had in some form this ingredient of changing darkness. Through that, Shehahamshacha de Matan Torah, that the Hamshacha, the drawing down of Elikus that took place by Matan Torah, Haisala Achrei Heidas Yisrael, it followed, it came only after first the acknowledgement of Yisrael, that Yisrael was declaring the greatness of Hashem over Lahavdil, all the other forms of darkness. Through this, Nasa Yisrin Kaviyachal Bahatera Shanitna B'Matan Torah. This gave an added advantage, so to speak, in the Torah that was given in Matan Torah, that it should contain in some form the advantage of being brought about from Avodah, from Tachtin. Av shenitna mitzad milmayla, even though overall, generally speaking, Torah was the initiative of Hashem, was the descent of Elikus into the world, and not yet the Avodah of the world. But it's bidugmas, it contains in a subtle way. It has a similarity, it has something that's similar to Yisrein ha'er haba min ha'cheshach, to light that comes from the transformation of darkness, because it contained this acknowledgement of Yisrael, of how Elikus, how godliness is greater than the darkness. Elisha b'Matan Torah, nevertheless, by Matan Torah doesn't have in a complete sense this advantage. By Matan Torah, the event, the experience of Matan Torah was l'mayla, was that godliness came down into the world. It just contained in a subtle sense this other ingredient, because there was that preparation, there was that prerequisite to Matan Torah. So kivan shenesina satera haisel mitzad l'mayla, since after all the giving of the Torah was an event of Elikus, godliness coming down into the world, it wasn't really connected with the world. Vaidas Yisrael, that element of worldliness, that acknowledgement of Yisrael, Haisarak Hagdama LeMatan Torah, was merely the preface, the preparation for Matan Torah, but it wasn't actually a part of the event of the Elikus coming into the world. Therefore, although Matan Torah contains that advantage in some form, but it's only in a potential way. It's only that through that Matan Torah can give the strength to the Avodah, to this type of Hamshacha afterwards. Hayisrin Kavayachal Bahatera, the advantage in Torah, Shenasa Yedei Heidas Yisrael, that resulted from this acknowledgement of Yisrael, Haya Rak B'Kayach, was only in a potential form. So it only is manifested in the fact that through this, Torah is able to empower, to give the strength to the avodah of bringing the Shechina down afterwards through Eskafia and Esabcha. By days and Nimshacha and Esinas Kayach, through this Torah, although Torah itself was still temporary, the Matan Torah itself didn't have this advantage, but through that the Torah was connected with the preface of the acknowledgement of Yisrael. Because of that, Torah is able to give the kayach, that after Matan Torah gives the strength that the avodah of actually changing darkness to light that happens after Matan Torah, then we'll have this advantage in an actual way, in a practical way, the way it is after Matan Torah, that Iskafya V'Ishapcha brings Elikus in the world in a way that's it's internalized with the world.